guys, so if you're here to learn how to paint this beautiful rainbow lion. So everything you need to have today is listed down the bottom, and there is also a great warm-up video that you should watch prior to doing this so that you have all the skills that you need to be able to paint this. The link for that is just down the bottom as well. So what we are going to start by doing is, first of all, I'm going to say to you, this lion here is painted on an A3 piece of paper, or a really big piece of paper, but the lion I'm going to paint during our tutorial today is only on an A4 piece, just because it's a little bit harder for me to fit this into the screen. So I'm going to pop that over there so that I can remember what I'm doing. But the first thing you need to do is you need to trace the outline of your lion onto your piece of art paper. I've got a piece of my magic black paper here, which for the adults in the room is also called graphite paper or carbon paper or transfer paper sometimes. And I'm going to use that to trace. If you don't have some of this at home, then you can click the link below to see how to trace when you don't have access to something like this. There's a few ways you can go about it. Or you might like to freehand draw a lion on there as well and use the same techniques to paint it, but have a bit of a different lion. Totally up to you. So what I'm going to start by doing is have my piece of art paper facing up. I want my graphite paper facing black shiny side down, and I want my lion over the top. I'm going to use some sticky tape just to put all of that together so that nothing ends up moving around while I'm trying to trace it, so that I don't end up with a funny picture of a lion. So I could end up with his teeth over in his mane or something like that. So I'm using a red pen to trace because it doesn't matter, it'll go through onto my paper as black anyway, but I'm using red so that I know where I have done my outlines. Now you might notice I'm a bit rough with some of my outlines because it actually doesn't really matter if I get them in the exact same spot or not. They just have to give me a general idea. And I don't want to press too hard because my outlines will be really dark. Not that it matters very much if they end up being quite dark. But once the outlines are on the paper, they don't erase away unless you're using the other method, which is in that other video that I was talking about. Now, depending on how quickly you trace, I trace pretty quickly, I know. You might need to pause the video when I finish tracing just to catch up. But what I want to say is that you might notice that there's like this area here that has these stripes in it. That's just to remind me which area is going to be all painted black. You don't have to draw those stripes on. They're just there so that if you think it would be helpful to have those stripes reminding you, then you'll draw them on. They don't have to be drawn on exactly where they are though. These lines around the outside, you might like to do all of them or not. They're just to tell me where to stop painting my mane. So I am done tracing my lion. So take that off. Now, my black paper, if you have got this, you can use it over and over and over again. So don't get rid of it. The best way to store it is just to fold it in half and place it somewhere else so that black doesn't end up all over everything. So with any watercolor that you do, just reminding you a couple of important things. you need to work in layers. So when we work in layers, that means that we will paint from light to dark. So with our lion, what we'll start with is we'll start by painting his face, and then we'll move on to his mane, and then we'll finish off with any black that needs to go on. So there's a little bit of wet on wet, and there's a little bit of wet on dry with this lion. I'm gonna clean up my palette from my last painting session. Before you start painting, it's a good idea to also make sure you've got activated paints and that you've done the warm-up video shown below, and that you've got all the materials that you need. So, the colour of his face. The colour of his face is a little bit of a unusual kind of brown, orange kind of colour. And I'm just going to get a little piece of scrap paper just to test my colour to make sure it's what I want. So that looks pretty good to me, and that's just straight out of this palette. But if I wanted to make it a little bit darker, what I would do is I would just get my water, put it into the side little well over here, add some of that to it. It's going to be lighter at the moment, but I can then add some of a different color to it to get a different version of that. And that's not dark enough. That's why we've got this little piece of paper here to help me see what I'm working with. That looks pretty good to me. So I've just added a little bit of this brown, a little bit of this kind of tan color together to give me that color there. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to paint that everywhere I can see that my lion is tan colored. Even the bits where it's quite dark. So that means I'm going to paint it over this whole area. There's a little bit of a white space just there, so I'm going to leave that white. It's a white space just there as well, so I'm going to leave that white. All of this here is tan, and it doesn't matter if I get this tan color where it's meant to be black, because the black will paint straight over the top of that. So I'm painting this all tan everywhere. It doesn't matter that much if I get it into the mane a little bit as well, because the colors that I'm painting will be darker and they will just go straight over the top down to here. So that is the first part of my lion, and I'm going to leave that all tan. Now, what you might notice is that this bit here is a bit lighter. So what I'm going to do is actually just going to clean my brush off with water, scrape some of that water off, and pop the water into that wet space and touch over where I've already painted tan while it's all wet, because I want that tan color to be there, but I want it to be a lot lighter than it is on the side. So it's dark on the side there, so I've added a bit too much of that. Just gonna mop that up a bit using my paper towel. So I can use my paper towel like an eraser. I can go dab, 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 and that will pick up some of that tan color that I put down. But I do want that to be tan, just not very dark. Same for this side, because that's his little nose kind of area. Really light tan. Touching only very lightly with my brush to make it so that I can be a bit more precise. Okay, so we've done our first layer of our lion there. Now, our face has a couple of layers. Because we don't need it to be super stripy, what we can do is we can actually start painting our next layer on before it's fully dry. So I'm going to use this color here in my stack of paints. Just check that it's the right one that I want. Yep. To do my second layer. And that will be over the top of these spaces here. So just painting inside these spaces where I can see that he is darker. Around here, line. Down on top of all of the lines. Doesn't matter if they're a bit thicker than the lines I've actually got on my page. Inside this big space. Doesn't matter if it goes outside of the lines a little bit. Over here. And just where these lines meet the mane. Just painting them, just popping it on and flicking my brush up as I paint them. Over here, making them a bit darker. That there is part of it as well. That's part of the nostril and the nose space. Okay. Now what I'm noticing is that I've even got some bits that are darker again than that. And so to achieve that, I'm going to get some of this colour here, get it on my brush and just add it back into that tan colour I've got that I mixed up on the side of my normal paint palette. I'm going to get a little bit of it, and while this is wet, I'm actually just going to tap some of that paint in around the edges. That's going to give me a nice shadow effect. Now, it's not super necessary, but it just helps to make him look a little bit more realistic in his face. Of course, he's like a mythological lion anyways, because he's got a rainbow mane. And I probably should have said this earlier, but of course, if you don't want to paint your lion exactly the same as this one, if you want to do slightly different colors, then please be my guest. I love seeing when people take what I've shown them and they make it their own. So painting that darker color over not all of the places, but just some of those places there. Just in some places, just leaving it a little bit messy. I want it to look very majestic, so I'm just adding some of that tan just around so that it's not all one color everywhere. I kind of want it to be a bit patchy, I suppose is the word that I'm putting it. He's lived a life, this lion. He hasn't stayed in a cave waiting on other people to serve him. He's lived his life, gone out into the world. Okay. I think that's it for the first, for our face. I think that might be done. So next up, we will paint our, actually what we will do, we might paint some of our teeth and our tongue, because the reason I say that is because if I go to paint my mane now, some of this is wet and I might end up with some of my main colors in my face. I don't really want that to happen. It's not the end of the world if it does, but yeah, I just prefer it not to blend that way. And I do need to paint this tongue and these teeth before I go on and paint the black, because otherwise I'll have black all through my teeth. And lion's teeth are actually a little bit yellow. They're not white. So I'm going to collect some of this color here. I'm going to make it really, really wet though, because I don't want them to be like fluorescent yellow. I just want them to be a little bit yellow. And even that yellow that I've got there is probably a little bit too dark. Here. Now, the trouble that I have now is that these are a bit dark. So what I've done there is I've just got my paintbrush, tapped that on there, and I'm just going back over that with a dry paintbrush just to pick up some of that pigment, that color. It's just a little bit darker than I would have liked it. And these teeth up here, they stay white, so we don't paint those at all. Now, what we're going to do now is it's probably time that I need to use my heat gun a little bit. Now, heat gun, I have a heat gun. This can be a dangerous tool. If you touch the end, it can be quite hot, but you may not have one of these at home anyways. It's not super necessary. What you might do is you might just pause the video, wait for it to dry, and then come back. Or you might ask if you can use someone's hairdryer in your home to dry this off. Of course, if you're a little person, you might need some help from an adult to use those tools. So I know that this isn't dry yet because when I pick it up, it's still shiny. You don't want it to be shiny. So I'm just going to dry these off. And I just dried my teeth because I still want to paint my tongue. So get my water on my brush, pick my tongue colour. I think I'm going to paint the tongue this colour here. Let's check that on my little scrap piece of paper. Oh, that's a bit too pink, I think. I think that might be better. That is better again. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to mix a new colour. I'm going to get my water on the side, put it on there, get some of this kind of really light pink, some of this darker pink, pop it in there, and then I end up with that kind of, that colour there that can be some of my tongue. I'm going to paint that through the middle, and then because I actually want my tongue to be darker around the outsides and even darker again at the back there, I'm going to pick up some of that pink and paint that at the back. Maybe even I'll go bold and I'll be nice and red there on the sides at the back. And I'm letting that light pink and that red touch because I do want them to mix together. So clean my brush off. My space is really wet. I'm going to dry my brush off a bit, and then I'm going to blend those together, pick up some of that paint with my brush, kind of like a mop, and then move that down to the spaces I haven't got anything yet. Okay, doesn't look very tongue-like yet, but it will once we paint a line on it when we're done. Okay, so next we are going to paint our mane, which is the most exciting bit if you ask me. And I like to start over here. So I need to check and make sure that it's all dry, which mine is not. So I'm going to use my heat gun, but you might have waited long enough for yours to be dry. Don't worry too much about the whole thing being dry, but if you've got your tools handy and you've paused the video, you might as well dry the whole lot. But I'm just trying not to spend too much time on the drying tool. And what I am going to do with my lion is I am going to paint him so that he starts from red, goes to a little bit of a lighter color, yellow, then green, blue, purple, red, orange, purple, and then kind of links back in around there that there's a similar color here and here, okay? Might look slightly different to the painting I showed you right at the start, just because sometimes, you know, I get in the zone and I just go for it. So I'm going to start with this color here, but you can do yours however you like. And all I'm going to do is when I paint this, I'm going to paint little lines that touch, okay? And the only place I don't want those to go is on my lion's face. And I want those to be quite rough around the edges there. I don't want to paint a smooth line. I want them to be rough so that it looks furry. And I've just done a little bit. And what I'm going to do next is grab my next color, which I'm going to choose this one here. And I'm just going to paint that over the top of where that finished into the next space. And then I'm going to do my next color, which I'm going to pick this one here. And again, I do that same motion, making sure I touch the previous place. And then clean that off and go to my Next colour, start to paint that on, touching the space that I just worked on. Now, when I start to get to this space, I want to paint these on so that there are some gaps, so that it actually looks really a lot like fur. If I leave some gaps, then I know that there is, you know, it's furry, it's not perfect, which is what we want. So then I'm going to go to a darker green colour from that green, overlap. This line here is just to show us where to start adding some of a second layer when we get to it. Like I said before, it doesn't matter if we overlap those colours. I actually want to overlap those colours so they blend together a little bit. I'm going to go into a darker green from that green there, leaving some gaps with my stripes, because remember, I want to make it look like real fur. So painting that on, patchy. Then I'm going to use some of this colour here, go down the side here. Doesn't matter if they touch, want them to touch so they blend together a bit. And use some blue now. Notice I'm not going straight to the head because I actually want that to be red. That's just something I just like the way it looks when that's nice and red near his face. You can paint it blue there as well though, of course. Oops, I don't want that same blue that I just had. I want a new blue. Blue down here. Notice my gaps there. Paint some purple. Some more purple. And then I'm going to pop in my really dark red up onto those points where it touches his face, where I put a little bit of brown before. Overlapping but leaving some white spaces as well. And when I overlap, I actually take some of that colour back with me. It's just kind of what happens. I just noticed that needs a bit more colour there. I didn't fill it in all the way. Okay, over here I'm going to add some of, I think I'm going to add this colour. Okay, and here's where I do need to be a bit careful because this part here is actually white. So I don't want to go inside those spaces. Just being a bit careful there. And just outlining that. That's going to be black, so that's not a problem. Popping that there. Moving into that purple kind of purplish shades, so add some more of that pink and then that purple there, making sure the edges are rough. And around those teeth, being careful because I don't want to get paint in my teeth area. That would probably look a little bit silly. And now this paint palette's really good, but if I were to comment on something that it could do to improve, it could have more purple. So I'm gonna make a little bit of purple on my side here. I'm gonna put some of that purple over there. I'm gonna add some blue to it. I'm gonna add some red to it because blue and red make purple. I just want a darker shade of purple than what is available to me in the palette. Okay, and of course, if you want to check that purple, you can paint it onto your spare piece of paper and check it, or you can just go for it. Add some purple down the bottom there. And then the place I have to be careful is around his mouth. So I'm going to turn it on the side. And I'm going to start to paint that, but just be careful. Over to here. A little bit of that purple at the top there to connect it back up. Paint in around his teeth. Painting just super carefully around that space. Okay, and then going to pop that purple in all the way around there. Just outline that space so that I don't accidentally paint inside. Although it doesn't matter as much around that part because it's black. Still just a good habit to get into. I'm just doing those rough lines again because it's furry. We want them to look a bit furry, right? I'm gonna add some red in there just to give it some dimension. Just over the top of where I've put that purple so that it's not all the same type of purple. Like I said, being careful. All right, that looks pretty good as far as I'm concerned for that mane. Now, what you can do, if you want to make it look super fluffy, is where you've got these colours to start with, you can actually go back in and add just a couple of little lines over the top with those colours, the same as what you had there before. And that will, you don't have to do this if you don't want, but adding that second layer of colour over the top helps it to look even more fluffy. Just some random lines over the top of it there, so there's lots of layers of paint happening. I think that'll do for my mane. Pretty happy with that. Now, we're just missing all of the detailed sections, aren't we? So I'm just going to change my water out. Actually, no, I'm not. I've got all of these black spaces now to do. And all right, time to get the black. So what I'm going to do is so this is super important with the black. I need to make sure everything is super dry. If it's not super dry, what will happen is when I add the black in, it's not gonna go on precise. It's gonna spread out everywhere where the paint is wet. And I don't really want that to happen. See how it's kind of moving out? Whereas this is dry. So if I paint black over the top, it just paints on like normal. I paint black on here, it spreads out everywhere. So we don't want that. So it needs to be super dry. So I'm gonna use my heat gun again. And I'm drying the whole thing off because I don't want to lean over my wet spaces. Remember, you use your hairdryer, or you just be patient and let it just dry and come back to it if you don't have access to something like that. So I'm going to flip it around, make it a bit easier for myself to reach the spaces that are going to be black. Okay, so black goes into his nose. So this whole area here is black. You might find it easier to use a texture to do the areas black, or you might like it to use the paintbrush that came with the paint set, or just a smaller paintbrush that you've got. Because it is quite a detailed area. Just filling in all of this mouth area with the black. Super careful around his teeth. Checking in to make sure I haven't missed anything that's black up the top there. Nope. Okay, so then around this area here, around the top of his teeth, is black as well. Up through there, down through there, over there, around there. Now he's starting to look a bit special, isn't he? And then, I don't know, oh yes, I just missed it on my outline. I forgot to draw a line there, but that doesn't matter. I can freehand draw that on. Paint all of this black. I wasn't sure if I forgot to do the outline on the actual outline or if I forgot to do it just on my reference, on my copying. Okay, so on the lion picture that I showed you before, his tongue kind of blends in. Now, it's a bit of a tricky technique, so you can just leave it like this if you like, but what you can do if you do want it to blend in is just with some water, some cleanish water, obviously that water's not super clean, just scrape most of the water off. My brush is still a bit wet, and all I'm going to do is just wet that tongue over and just touch the edge of that black. And see how that black is actually bleeding into where the tongue is, just to smooth the transition between tongue and back of mouth, I think it would be called. Okay, so that's how you do that. You wet it with your brush and just drag some of that black paint down. Not much though, just a little bit. And if you're getting any of these sort of harsher lines, you just use the clean water to smooth those lines out. Push the black paint back, push the black paint back, and then it will smooth them. So then we still have a bit more black to do over here, just in that space there. And then we outline around the teeth a bit. Okay, now that is our black done. There are still some other areas that we need to do though, and they are kind of black but a bit more grey. So I have two ways I can do that. I can either use the grey in my palette, or I can mix some of the grey and the black together to give me a bit of a darker grey than what's there, because the grey that I have is not quite as dark as I would like it to be. If you don't have grey, you can just mix your white and your black, and that will make it more of a like a grey colour as well. So I'm getting that, and then what I need to do with that is underneath his mouth here on this section. That's probably a little bit darker than I want it to be. So what I'm going to do is wash my brush off, dry it off, tap it on my paper towel, and then just pick some of that up like a mop. Your parents will thank me later. I'm teaching you how to mop. Mop that up and just move that around that space there that's outlined just underneath that little white tuft. Okay, pop it there. And then I'm going to use that same kind of grey black. Water it down a little bit more because mine's a bit too dark. Tap it off on the side. And then I've got to add in some more details around his face. So just over the top of some of these lines. And in particular, his closed eye. Okay, It wouldn't matter if you did that totally black, by the way. If you just want to do it black, you can. I just prefer to do it grey. Okay, just some lines around here. Just outlining some of these spaces just loosely. Okay, and what probably the more important thing to do there is actually to do the dots that represent his where his whiskers are. Dot, 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 dot. And they go over this space here. Up into here, next to that first crease. And there's some over here too. Now that is pretty much done. I'm looking at my line and thinking, oh, it wouldn't hurt for him to have a little bit more darkness around some of the spaces on his face. Like just here, I wouldn't mind a little bit more darkness, and just here as well. But I'm like being a little bit pedantic. I absolutely do not need to do that. I might be very happy with how my line looks without doing that. So do not feel like you have to do that. There we go. I think he's done. And there you have, once he's dry, there you have your beautiful rainbow lion.